So, greetings and welcome to today's educational program, Navigating the New Normal, Effectively Leading Teams in a Virtual World. This is your moderator, Doug Wood, with the ASQ's Quality Management Division. Today we have the distinct pleasure of hearing from Zac Jarrard. Please join me in welcoming him. Zac Jarrard is the president of Jarrard Consulting, LLC. The company is dedicated to bringing out the best in people through team building activities, project management training, and workshops to improve intergenerational communication at work. Zac holds a Master of Science in Information Systems and Business Analytics, MPA, and MBA from Park University. His research interests include gamification, project management, and working across different generations. Outside of his company, Zac is heavily involved in the community. He's a proud ASQ senior member who serves as the past chair of the Kansas City section. Zac is an Eagle Scout who aspires to make the world a better place for everyone. And so, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Zac Jarrard. Zac, the floor is yours.
Awesome, thank you. It's great to be back and see everyone with QMD, or also folks that are from across ASQ or outside of ASQ. I'm excited that you've joined us tonight and we get to talk about this new normal that we're in and navigating this virtual or hybrid world. So just to give a quick overview of our session for today, so we'll talk about leading in-person versus remote teams, share some best practices regarding building culture within organizations, and then I'll share some thoughts and perspective on how you can thrive in what a lot of people are calling this new normal work environment in terms of being in perhaps a hybrid or a remote setting in an organization. So you might wonder, what's this term new normal mean? And I did some research on it, and I found that it first surfaced after the Great Recession from 2008 and 9, and then it came back around in 2020 to describe the post-COVID-19 world. And it's hard to believe how much has changed just in the last couple of years. So if we go back to pre-COVID-19 pandemic, for a lot of organizations, the focus was on in-person events and engagement. When you would do work, you go to an office, you might have computers, you might still do some virtual meetings, but there were not a lot of work at home options. There were organizations that were starting to pilot this. It was not super common at that time. There were also some virtual events, but not nearly as many as there are today. And then very limited options to work at home. For the most part, it was assumed you'd be in person, unless it was perhaps a special case. And then post-pandemic, we got thrust into an increasingly hybrid and virtual world almost overnight or within a matter of months. And then we saw an explosion in virtual work and events. It seemed like early on during the pandemic that pretty much everyone was offering webinars. And then we've seen a shift toward working at home or offering at least a hybrid work option where you could go to the office maybe 1 or 2 days a week and then work at home the rest of the time. And there are some organizations today still trying to figure out, do we have our workers come back to the office? Do they stay home? Do we mandate them to come back to the office? For some workers, they might have moved, so it makes it harder to have them come back to the office if they've already moved away. So you might wonder what changed within this time span going from pre to post-pandemic. We realized that so a global pandemic could be a risk factor to look at within organizations. This sudden shift to remote work, the nice part was that we already had a lot of the tools that made that easier. But then it also changed how we view work-life balance or work-life integration, and especially early on during the early part of the pandemic, for groups that were taking care of other folks within their family, so dependents, so it could be elderly folks or perhaps children Being a parent around this time was really stressful. And then also for organizations, for most of the professionals that I knew around this time, they picked up more work than they had compared to pre-pandemic. And so that brings up a question. How do you lead within this new normal? And I think it's good to start off with a brief definition. So the way that I think of leadership, so you're able to provide a sense of direction or help create a vision with a group of people, and then motivate them to help achieve it in some way or support them. You've got really good communication skills, so being able to speak to folks, written communication, you can understand different communication methods and when to best use those. But then also being able to relate and connect with people, and showing empathy, showing that you really do care about your followers, and keeping their best interest in mind. So that brings up a question, uh, why should organizations care about investing in leaders? And it's interesting as I've looked more at this topic and more at leadership and management. At one of the conferences I was at a couple years ago, there was interesting statistics shared that I don't think I'll ever forget. So for most managers, the average manager will get their first management role at about age 35. But here's the weird part is that they'll get trained on how to be a manager when they're about 43 or 44. So imagine getting a job that you haven't been trained for, and then you spend 8 to 10 years, and then you get trained on it later. And it really didn't make any sense to me. And the other part too is that um, there have been some studies done to show that your manager and how you interact with them, how they treat you, that can have a huge effect on your self-esteem, but also your health. And there was an extreme case that I heard about where there was one manager in an organization that ended up causing 15 people to leave because they didn't treat them well, they misbehaved, they got, in some criminal trouble. Um, and so that, going back to this question of investing in leaders, it can make a huge difference with regards to retention, but then also employee engagement in an organization. And that helps you build that foundation so your organization can continue to thrive today and in the future. And it's especially important to, uh, be looking at some of your emerging leaders or some of your younger generations, because pretty soon or in the near future, they might take some of those leadership roles as well. And then it helps enhance your culture in your organization. There's benefits for teams, whether they're in person or virtual, for having leaders that have gone through at least some level of training. For leaders, they'll be more open to delegating tasks, so they won't be necessarily as controlling of some of their teams. They'll be able to help develop a vision and set goals for their associates or the folks that they're leading. And then I think it helps them be able to deliver feedback and then offer a more balanced perspective in terms of performance. So being able to acknowledge things that are going well, but then also areas for improvement for employees versus just focusing too much on the negative aspect. And so as we look at teams, whether they're in person or remote, um, you know, there's some key points to look at. So in terms of your in-person groups that you've got, generally for the most part, in the workplace, they share a office location that's close by. So it could be perhaps one building they're in, maybe a series of buildings. Um, I think it tends to be easier to network with folks if they're in person. They're able to see each other. They can have small interactions like, "Hey, how are you doing?" Or they could drop by the office. So that's why I'd argue for in person. It's a little bit easier to network, or at least within the organization where the buildings are located, even if it's not like the main headquarters for organization. And then what's interesting is that the employees tend to be kind of from a similar geographic area. To give an example, so my alma mater that Doug had mentioned, a lot of their students are from the Kansas City area. And that's just because they're in close proximity to the main campus or main buildings in the metro area. And then when we look at remote teams, um, for some of them, they might have what's called a hotel desk at an organization. So it might be a hybrid worker where they're working maybe like 1 or 2 days a week in the office. So they'll have a temporary location they'll go into in person and then work at home the rest of the week. Or they might have perhaps a home office or space they'll work at. Or, if they're outside their home, maybe they're working in a car, maybe they're in a hotel, maybe they're in another spot. The nice part about remote work is that as long as your technology is working, you're not limited to one geographic location. And I would argue, at least in the context of an organization, it can be harder to connect with people. And I think that's just because with remote work, you can be much more efficient. And so it's harder to get those organic interactions with associates compared to being in person. And then for remote or hybrid teams, your employees tend to be more dispersed geographically. So they could be, you could have one person on Eastern time, one person in Central time. You might have one person from Alaska or maybe India calling in. And so that brings up some of the key differences kind of between in-person or remote or hybrid teams. The first one being the sense of connection they have to each other, but then also the organization. And studies have been done to show that if you're in a physical office, um, on site, you have a different relationship with the organization versus if you're remote or you're not on site as often. So your sense of commitment tends to be a little weaker. And it's not necessarily bad, it's just, you're not necessarily as close in proximity to that organization or their headquarters or whatnot. Um, Creating relationships, so getting to know your associates and your team. I think in some ways it can be harder for remote teams. And then I think also in person too, if you have folks that are constantly running, putting fires out, it can also be harder for them to get to know each other. And then with remote teams, you've got a greater diversity of thought and perspectives you're bringing together. And that's just because you have folks from different areas that might be more culturally diverse compared to if you have folks from one geographic area or kind of a similar area. And so that brings up another question. Um, how do we engage folks? And then what are some challenges or obstacles that could get in the way? One of them is they might not feel like they have time. You might have some leadership. They might not feel that investing in your remote or in-person team is a priority. That they've got ABC other issues to look at. There might be capacity problems. They might have folks that are overloaded already, or they might not be sure what the return is. They might say, well, if we do a 2 or 4 hour team building activity and we pay ABC amount, what are we going to get back from that? This might be leaders or managers, they might not be clear on that. And then also technology could be another issue too. So you might have folks that have different comfort level with, um, a software or doing a team building activity together, even if it's in person. You might also have poor execution. And I think that this has happened a lot in past years with organizations. They've forced some of these team building activities, and it's kind of left a bad taste in some managers' mouths or perspectives. And then there might not be a clear outcome defined or goals for activity. So you might be well-meaning, you might bring folks together for a happy hour, or maybe we jump on a platform like WebEx and do activities together. But if there's no end goal, we could have all this fun and engagement, but then there might not be any business value realized from engaging your team or doing an activity together. And for organizations that do not look at engagement, there are a lot of challenges they might face. Um, when you look at employee recruitment and retention, one of the factors that helps drive retention is if employees have at least one friend at work. And it doesn't mean that they're best friends or whatnot, or they hang out all the time. But if they have colleagues that they feel like they're connected to, they'll be more likely to stay. Another point is a sense of disconnection from their team or other associates. So if they're not getting to know each other very well, um, they might wonder, besides work, what else is keeping me at the organization or connected to other folks. And then you might run into lower retention and engagement. So if you have folks that are constantly just working and there's not much being done to build up teams or get to know each other, then there's not as much holding them together or at an organization versus if they knew each other at least a little bit. And while some of that stuff I mentioned did sound bad, there are opportunities out there to bring people together. So one option to look at for engaging our in-person remote teams is to get better at doing meetings. And I actually have a separate talk I'll be doing in this series on facilitation, where I'll go a lot deeper into meetings, looking at steering committees, but some simple stuff that I've used to improve some of the meetings that I've been in. One is to start on a positive note. So to, introduce myself to folks, have people introduce themselves if it's the first time they've met, and, throw out a joke, maybe ask them how they're doing, ask about holiday plans, and then making sure there's an agenda. So when you schedule meetings, people are clear about what's going to be accomplished, and then at the end, providing a summary and making sure you have follow-up. And you might see this, you might wonder, well, why should I care about meetings? And so a couple of years ago, I'd met someone, they were looking at a study about meetings, and they found that in the year 2019, that the US economy had lost $1 trillion because of wasted time during meetings. And for some of us, we spend, maybe 20, 30% or more of our time in meetings. So taking those small steps to be intentional with those, that can make a huge difference in terms of engagement. And then, looking at relationships at work, making sure that we can provide vehicles to build those, but then also sustain them for the long run. So having check-ins with associates, so doing one-on-one meetings at least once a month, maybe a little more frequently depending on the type of work. And then another concept I'd heard about that's really interesting in this space, this idea of doing what's called a stay interview. So a lot of you have probably heard of an exit interview. That's where you're interviewing someone, as they're going out the door. But the idea of a stay interview is to interview and see, why someone is still at an organization, how they're doing, what they could do to meet their needs. Doing simulations, that could be another way to engage folks. Using gamification, doing game-based activities, even doing a contest. I had a colleague, they gave an example. They'd implement a new software and they were trying to get people at the organization to use it. So they found that within this software, they could publish a leaderboard to show who is using this software the most. And, the CEO found out, and, he was one of the people they were trying to get to use the software. So he started, tracking this leaderboard, and then all these other people jumped in. And so from doing this contest, not only did they engage folks and have a little bit of fun, but they got people to use that software, so achieving a business goal. And then recognizing too that for building and sustaining relationships at our workplaces, that it's more than just an annual team building activity, because we're constantly building our teams. Because what we found over time is that the relationship between employees and the employer with regards to loyalty is eroded. And so for a lot of organizations, they're having more turnover than they might have in the past. So their teams have to constantly be rebuilt. And there are opportunities out there for engaging folks, so you can increase satisfaction, and also productivity. You can get people to be creative, share new ideas that could help the organization, and then do skill development too to be able to help them thrive in their current role, but then also prepare for future leadership roles or other roles they want to pursue. And so kind of taking a step back, so looking kind of more at a macro level or a bigger picture, um, culture comes into play. And so some ways that I think about culture, um, this is customs, traditions that you've got at work, and some of it could be subtle. So to give an example, it could be perhaps the work schedule. So it might be 40 hours a week, maybe 37 and a half, maybe on Fridays you have certain traditions you do. Um, it could be even the language that you use in an organization, maybe the core values or symbols. And what's interesting is that when you look at culture, this can vary across an organization or even different sites or functional areas. So, for instance, some of my experience has been with working with technology professionals, and some of the stuff they're familiar with and that they're interested in is different than folks perhaps say in marketing or operations or quality, and that's okay, but just comes from their industry or their specialization they're interested in. And there's a lot of factors that could go into culture within an organization. You could have different generations in the workplace. So currently we have 5 different generations. We have the silent generation, baby boomers, Generation X, Generation Y or millennials, and then Generation Z, and then pretty soon we're going to add Generation Alpha as possibly a sixth generation. You could have, folks from the same area, folks from outside of the local area the organization could be in. Um, maybe change is a factor too. So you bring in new ways of doing stuff that could change the culture. So you might wonder why invest in culture? Like why look at that big picture versus just looking at a team level within an organization? It can help improve your productivity. It can help you innovate. There was a study from Forbes. They were looking at different organizations and diversity, and they found that organizations that are more diverse, they outperform their competitors, and they're also more innovative and more profitable compared to their competitors within the same industry. You also get to tap into diversity of thought. So by investing in building a high quality, positive culture, you encourage people to bring new ideas to the table. And even if their idea is not implemented or executed, they at least feel like they're heard. And then you can improve retention as well. And there's other benefits too for organizations. One is they can build a reputation as an employer of choice, and I think this is critical today. So I mentioned the generational mix we have. So currently we've got the silent generation. They're still some of them are still in the workplace, but they're retired for the most part or are currently retiring. You've got the baby boomer generation. So there's a chunk of them that are getting ready to retire right now. And you've got Generation X, Millennials, Gen Z, soon to be Generation Alpha, and increasingly we're seeing that we'll have a worker shortage in the future because those generations I had mentioned following Generation X tend to be smaller because family sizes have been smaller. So for organizations, they'll need to be mindful of their reputation and their culture because people will look online. They'll see, what reviews were written about this organization, what do past associates say, and, investing in culture and having that good reputation, that can help attract candidates to your organization. You can also build a sense of ownership for teams and associates in an organization. Um, and then another benefit too is connecting with different customer segments. So more than just perhaps your local area or your country, but possibly expanding it to different countries, different demographic types, which opens up a whole bunch of new possibilities for bringing in new customers, but then also perhaps new ideas or perspectives as well. And so you might wonder, at a team level, we had talked about obstacles that could get in the way for engagement, but what about across a whole organization? So across multiple departments or multiple teams. So looking kind of at that 10,000-foot level, one of the challenges could be um, that there's just not clear goals about what culture is. Even at some organizations today, you might ask them, how would you describe their culture? And they might be like, well, I don't know. They might be like, the culture is just whatever people bring to the table, which personally I think is a really bad answer. Uh, One of the challenges I think within this area is how some organizations perceive their employees today. So if we go back before the 1970s, when you would look at organizations and how leaders would talk about their associates, there was more of a stakeholder focus, meaning that they would look at their employees and the community kind of in a holistic way. And after the 70s, there was a shift from a stakeholder focus to a shareholder focus. And so with that shift, we saw employees increasingly become viewed as just a cost. And to be frank, they are a cost to an organization. You look at when you look at budgets, employees do tend to be a decent chunk of that. But imagine this. Imagine if all the employees in your organization were revenue generating, or if they could contribute ideas to help save money or, lower costs. Um, I saw this firsthand. I worked on a Six Sigma black belt project. We had some investment on the front end, but the outcome from that was helping the organization I was at the time save or retain millions of dollars in revenue. And that's just from one project. So imagine if every employee did that at your organization, the benefit would be enormous. So I think, being able to shift how we perceive employees, not just as a cost, but as a possible source of revenue, but then also as a creative person, or someone that has a perspective that could add diversity of thought, and help us be more competitive or achieve our goals. Not engaging stakeholders, that's another issue that could come up with building a culture. And then structural changes as well. So if you have, if you have an acquisition happen, if you've got different departments merging or unmerging, or changes to the way the organization's structured, that could affect building a strong culture as well. And then resource constraints are another issue. And one of the points under this is that there might not be a commitment to build a culture, but then also sustain it. So you might have on the front end, maybe all this effort to do culture 1 year, but then if you don't have as much the next year, you might lose those gains that you had from that first year of having that focus. And you might not have the expertise either. And that's okay because there are folks out there that have expertise in team building and culture. They can help you. And then another part too is not having culture in your strategic plan. Obviously it's not the only goal you want to have, but having that at least as a one priority, that would help a lot in giving it at least visibility at that executive level. And some of the challenges, so from not investing in culture, we see higher rates of turnover, and I even read about this while the pandemic was happening. You had companies that, for decades they would not take care of their people, not invest in their culture. And so when the pandemic happened, in the early days we had what was called the Great Resignation, where, people reevaluate their priorities, all these jobs opened up. And so because organizations hadn't invested in relationships with their associates, when they got offered more money, they jumped ship without hesitation. And so, those organizations that did not invest in this, they really struggle with turnover. And then also recruitment and engaging folks, because if the culture doesn't feel inclusive, or you don't feel like you'll at least be heard, what's the point in contributing ideas? A way to think of it, I had someone describe this to me a long time ago. It's kind of like if you're a kid and you draw a picture and you show it to someone and they're like, "Hey, this looks great." They might keep drawing pictures, but then if one person or if someone really is critical of it, then they might not want to do that again. They might be like, well, you didn't like my picture the first time, so why am I going to come back and share it with you a second time or whatnot? And then you've also got a brain drain or a loss of creativity that could happen, and then a loss of diversity of thought, which could harm innovation. Okay, so there are obstacles out there that I discussed, but there are also opportunities that we could look at. One way to bring culture to life is to make it a priority. Put it into the strategic plan somewhere. Make sure you have someone assigned to it and you're monitoring it on an ongoing basis. Do surveys. Try out stakeholder interviews, stay interviews to see why people are still at your organization, and then try to incorporate it into some aspect of your performance review process. That can help hold folks accountable. And then you want to invest in keeping your culture going. So provide those resources to your in-person or remote teams to support team building activities, even if it's a small amount. It doesn't have to be a lot to do team building activities. Look at employee appreciation and engagement programs. I remember when I started working, when I would see people get promoted at my organization that I knew, if I found out someone was leaving, I'd send them a note. So it didn't cost any money, but I just said something like, "Hey, I saw you got promoted. Just want to congratulate you on that." Or if someone was leaving, I'd send them a message and say, "Hey, I want you to know I heard you were leaving. I really enjoyed working with you on ABC, and I wish you the best of luck moving forward." And people were shocked I did that, but in my mind, it's like, why don't you do that? And the other part too is that you never know. You might end up working with that person again. And so having them remember that, be like, hey, I remember you wrote me that nice note. Let's catch up or whatnot. That can help you with networking as well. And then you want to celebrate. So celebrate, your accomplishments that you've achieved. So improving satisfaction or retention, but then also being transparent. So sharing, your progress on culture. So being like, hey, our satisfaction's here. We're trying to get here. Here's what we're going to do in the next quarter or the next 6 months to try to address that gap. And there are opportunities organizations can leverage from having a strong culture. I think one of them that's underappreciated today is being able to have an international perspective. And I think this is something that in terms of generations in the US, Generation Z and Generation Alpha can definitely bring to the table for organizations. Um, Investing in culture can help improve your retention, but also your recruitment. And then you can be able to scale ideas across an enterprise. So you can have folks be comfortable with the idea of failure or sharing their creative idea. To give an example of a company that exemplifies this, you look at Southwest Airlines, they have people calling them all the time to apply to work there. And imagine if your organization was like that. You have more applicants wanting to be there than you have positions available. It's a great place to be in because then you can be selective with the folks you bring in, or have some of the top talent in the labor market out there at your disposal. And so as we step back, thinking about, well, how do we all thrive within this new normal and, building culture and engaging our remote teams, in the context of leaders, stuff they could think about. So a lot of us are quality professionals. We've probably looked at continuous improvement for, it could be products or services, but leaders want to look at continuous improvement for themselves and them developing as a leader. So it's critical for them to develop some of those soft skills that are out there. Being strong communicators, being able to engage in active listening, demonstrating empathy, showing that they care about other people, integrating some of this into a development plan that they've got for the long run, for 3 to 5 years, and then looking at emerging trends. To give an example, one emerging trend I've been following pretty closely is artificial intelligence. Chat GPT. For some of those trends you look at today, in the next 5 to 10 years, they'll become commonplace. So getting a hold on them now or familiarity with it will help you stay ahead for the future. And then you want to get out there and interact with people, and not just folks from your functional area or your network, but also folks from a different functional area, or maybe someone new that you could add to your network. And in the context of a team, you'd want to try to schedule recurring meetings with each of your team members, even if it's just once a month. And then depending on scheduling and how often you need to see your team members, consider doing daily check-ins or even perhaps a weekly meeting, once a week where you can connect. And then going along with what I was talking about earlier with meetings, make sure if you're scheduling meetings with your team that you're being very intentional, and then as respectful as you can of their time. Sometimes you have meetings run over for certain reasons, but if you can stay within time, that's great. And then, look at ways you can do team building activities. And when you're looking at investing in those, you want to be clear about what the outcome is. So, we're trying to develop ABC skill. We're trying to grow engagement. We have some folks that are kind of shy. We want to get them to share ideas or have some fun and be creative. Um, Try out some different ideas. Try out a digital game. Try out doing an in-person game. Go to a different location. Talk to your team. See what motivates them. What are ways to engage them, and you might be surprised. For some of your associates, believe it or not, you might have game experts among you, especially for the younger generations. A lot of them have spent most of their lives growing up in a digital world playing online, so they might have gaming expertise you could tap into to help with doing team building. And then, get feedback. So reflect on your experience and then improve it over time and then scale your team building activities, to match the success you have. And then share it with other teams too within your organization because they might also benefit as well. And then looking at organizations, so looking more at building culture across the enterprise or across multiple teams or functional areas. It's important for them to think about what success looks like in the context of culture. So understanding why is it important for our organization? Um, what values do we have? So when people interact with us, what do we want them to say about us or for folks internally to say about each other? Um, and then how do we get there? We know we know why culture is important. We know what values we want our folks to have. What do they need to do to achieve that? And then how do we sustain it? How do we keep that going? So as we're bringing in new associates, how do we help integrate our values into, what they do day to day? And then make sure you've got culture built into the strategic plan, and provide resources to support it, even if it's not a lot, even if it could be a little bit, that can make a big difference. Integrating it into your annual performance reviews, celebrating your wins. And then you want to strive for positive interactions as much as you can. And this can make a big difference. I remember reading somewhere that if you have someone do something negative to you, that it takes 5 positive interactions to get back to where you were. And so it wouldn't be until that sixth interaction that you have, you're at a better place than where you were originally. Something simple to do, celebrating milestones that employees have. For some of the associates I had, I would try to find their birthdays, or if you have folks that are from different cultures, looking at some of the holidays or days of cultural significance they recognize, and taking a minute to celebrate that with them as well. They'll find that to be valuable, and it shows you're respecting other cultures as well. Develop, professional development plans, but then you also want to look at your appreciation programs and find ways to sustain those, and then find different ways to show appreciation to people, because for some folks, they might not like getting a shout out at a department meeting. They might prefer receiving positive feedback in a one-on-one setting. Maybe they do not want to have uh, lunch or dinner with the president of a company. Maybe they want something else. So, building in different options for appreciation, so you can meet people where they are, and then also, find what motivates them and be able to meet that. But then you might wonder, for some of you, you might be like, well, I'm not a leader of a team. I'm not at a C-suite level to influence culture across the whole organization. What can I do as an individual within an organization to help make the culture better, or our teams better? Some thoughts on that, so you can try to build relationships with the folks around you. Check in with them occasionally, even if you're remote. Just sending them a message through like Microsoft Teams or a collaboration tool. Hey, I was thinking of you today. Just want to see how you were doing. Did you enjoy ABC Holiday? How's your team doing? Taking some time to celebrate wins they have. Even sharing positive feedback or a positive message. It doesn't cost you any money, to send a shout out to someone or to recognize things that are going well. And that can make a huge difference within an organization, having those little moments where you recognize folks. But then also ask people questions. You might be surprised what you find out. To give an example, um, I had someone ask me questions about stuff, and a coworker found out that I was really good at tutoring, and so I was able to help them with some issues they were having. But again, if they didn't get to know me, if they weren't a little curious about my background, they wouldn't have known that about me. Look at your career goals. Um, as much as we want organizations to be successful with cultures, there are also times where the culture might go downhill, and some signs that you might see that. Your, the quality of your products and services might be going down, your employee satisfaction's dropping, your turnover's going up. You might have people from across the organization leaving, whether it's at the top or at the bottom, across the board. You might have folks leaving, and your retention struggling. You might have a hard time getting new ideas. Those are signs that the culture is going downhill at an organization. Um, but even though that might be happening, as individuals, we can have some kind of roadmap for our career or our sense of direction. So thinking about where do we want to be in the next 3 to 5 years? What does success look like? Are we staying with this organization? Are we going somewhere else? And how do we get there? And also having a network too. So having other folks you're connected with, so that way if something does happen at your organization, you've got other options you can tap into. And then you want to be positive and respectful. So again, taking the time to recognize folks, being intentional about meetings, and then trying to get win-win opportunities when you can. It's not always possible, but as much as you can, that makes a big difference as well in organizations. And then here's some other resources to go beyond this talk, looking at leadership and culture. So this book by uh, Bill Joyner and Stephen Josephs about leadership agility. I think it's really interesting, and one of the main ideas behind it is that leadership isn't necessarily tied to position. You could have someone at the bottom of an organization that could be a positive change agent. So it's a really interesting read. The The second article on there, that's from Forbes about looking at leading remote teams. They're international. And then the article from John Coleman, it's from Harvard Business Review, talks about the power of curiosity in the context of culture. So it's an interesting read. And then there's some videos, and if you want to reach out, I'm happy to provide a copy of the slides, and I can provide the links for these articles, books, and videos if you'd like. Or if you're watching this video, you can reach out as well. Some of the videos here, so the one by Chris White provides some interesting thoughts on creating a work culture to bring out the best in folks. The second one, Draw Your Future. I've actually gone through this. The idea is that if you can draw what your future looks like, you could do the same thing in an organization or for your team. It's a really powerful activity to do, whether you're in person or if you're remote or in a hybrid environment. And then the last video, it actually came out before the pandemic occurred, but I still think there's a lot of themes that are applicable to today about managing cross-cultural remote teams. So I found it to be very interesting. And then just to provide an overview of what we covered during the session, so I talked about this idea of the new normal that we've experienced post-pandemic, leadership, and then brought that over to, how do you lead in-person or remote teams? What are some of the obstacles? What are some of the opportunities? Then we took a look at culture, so kind of that 10,000-foot level across the organization. What does that look like? Why is that important? What are some challenges? What are some opportunities? And then we talked about what leaders, organizations, and then professionals can do to be able to thrive in this kind of environment and to build a high quality culture. And also keeping in mind, too, one of the unique parts about quality is we have all these tools. Just as we use these to improve products and services, we can use them to help improve culture as well. And here's my contact information. I'm super active on LinkedIn. More than happy to connect with anyone today. Or if you're watching this recording, feel free to reach out. I do want to thank ASQ, the Quality Management Division, especially Doug and Shoba for helping put this together. And this is a part of a series, so if you're watching the recording, there will be another webinar about risk management and then another one about facilitation. So feel free to check those out. And then I will be at the World Conference this year. So if you're looking to come, I'd love to see you in person. And again, just want to thank everyone.
Thank you, Zach. Boy, that was a great talk. We appreciate you having you here. So with that, I'm going to stop the record here, and we're going to go on to our Q&A.